Hello, so as you can see, I have my Shattered Values project here. Remember, the first little bit is figuring out sort of how to make the gradations with the different colors, overlapping the colors, what colors you want to use, whether you want to use just a regular pencil, combination of colors, little handful of colors, tons of colors. It's completely up to you. But the main thing is, once again, making sure that all of your value scales within those shapes that you have created are as smooth as you can make them. So I'm going to zoom into this little corner because I want to remind you that every time you draw a line through the grid, whether it's a wavy line, whether it's a diagonal line, whether it's a curved line, or whether it's just the square from the original grid, each and every single shape that you have created there will have its own little miniature value scale. So if I zoom into this little section, you can see that there's a lot of different shapes in here. Okay, some of them are very small, some are much larger. And the big thing to remember is that not every single shape will have the exact same values in it. For instance, this little shape, which is really tiny, might only have a handful of values in it. Whereas this one, which is much larger, may have a more full range of values, and that is perfectly fine. So what I want to do is just do a couple more demonstration videos, just showing you some of the different options in terms of shading. I'm not going to talk very much because in reality, by now, you should sort of understand how to create a graduated value scale. And the purpose of these videos is just going to be to sort of get my example further along so that you can see some different ways to use value scale to create space and depth. And remember, if you are shading with regular graphite, I definitely recommend using a regular actual number 2 pencil or even one of your drawing pencils. I do not recommend using a lead pencil or a mechanical pencil simply because, as I had mentioned before, the lead or the graphite that is in that pencil is going to be quite hard and it's not going to be as smooth of a transition there, and it's going to be much more difficult to get a smooth transition. So as you can see, I'm just going across this space, getting lighter and lighter as I move along, pressing down less and less once I get into that lighter area. Now this pencil is pretty short, so it does become a little bit tricky to hold the pencil really far back. But once I am at the point where I am now, holding my pencil really far back is going to help me smooth out that value because more of the pencil will be touching the paper, which means I'm going to be creating less of a line and more of a nice smooth value there. And remember too that going back the opposite direction will really help fill in any of those little white gaps. So if I go back in the opposite direction here, very gently, it's going to get a little bit darker, but that's okay. The main thing is to just keep it as smooth as I can in there. And then as I start to get into those darker areas, I am going to press down a little bit more because now that I made that light spot darker, I have to make the rest of that shape darker in relation, so that the value scale idea is still there. So I'm just going to darken this part. So you can see how your value scale in each individual shape might change a little bit as you create it, depending on the values that you make. And now this is a pretty small shape, so it's not going to have a lot of really light values in there, and that is perfectly fine. So what I'm going to do now is take my dark blue to this sort of weird shape here, and I think I'm going to do dark down here and get lighter as I move up and around. So I'm going to hold my pencil pretty far back, situate myself so that I've got the tip of my pencil along that edge, not starting with my darkest dark. And just pressing down less and less as I move up. And then I'm going to turn because I want this actual value scale itself to turn a bit too. And then continue pressing less and less as I move across until eventually I'm back to white. Now on that first layer, there's a lot of little white fuzzy area in the outside of the shape. That's okay on the first layer, especially if you start it nice and light. Because now what I'm going to do is go back over that first layer with the second layer. Not pressing down much harder yet, but just really filling in those gaps and taking that value scale all the way to the edges of the shape. Turning my page as I go and keeping things as consistent and smooth as I can as I get into those lighter and lighter areas. So just pressing down less and less. And now at that point, I could consider that shape pretty much done, or I could go over with the darker blue again. I could add another color. I could go over with the lighter blue. The options are really up to you. They're pretty much endless. One thing that I do want to point out is that you don't have to finish every single value scale before you finish the whole piece. Because value and shading are quite relative, I could easily finish this whole thing and then go back into certain shapes if I feel like they need to be darker in any area. That is an absolutely fine option. Now, one thing I do want to point out also is that I had several people ask if they could do like one color on one side and another color on the other, fading into each other. That's perfectly fine. So that's what I'm going to do on this shape here. I'm going to put my red on this edge. And then I'm going to have it fade a little more quickly than I usually would, so that I get some white space in between the two colors that I'm going to be using. And remember, my first layer is not going to be my perfectly smooth layer. And then before I do a second layer on that color, I'm going to go ahead and get some violet and turn my page so that I'm using the tip of the pencil on that outer edge again. And I'm going to go ahead and do a first layer on that side. Now, one thing you will notice when you are using multiple colors is that some colors are easier to shade with than others. So that's just an important thing to kind of take note of as you are working, because you will have to adapt some of your technique depending on the color that you're using. So for instance, the violet is harder than the red in terms of like thickness and stiffness of the pencil. So I have to be a little bit more careful, especially as I get into those lighter values, and I have to pay more attention to my transition from dark to light. So now I'm just going to go ahead and do a second layer on the violet. And then I will do a second layer on the red. And I'll keep progressing in that fashion until I feel like I have both sides to where I want them. So pressing down less in this section is definitely a bit more of a process than with the regular pencil because you can't erase as much. So you do want to be a little bit more careful with that transition from the beginning. So I'm going to turn my page, pick my red back up, and basically do the exact same thing on the red side. Being careful along that edge because I don't want to go outside of my shape. And my main thing here is just making that transition from red to white as smooth as I can. So now I'm pretty close to the white section, so I'm not going to press down very hard at all. And it may even overlap the purple a little bit, and that's completely fine. I may not really have any white in there. So now I'm just going to go back through and just kind of smooth things out a little bit more. Use some of my circular shading technique here. Because with this being sort of a round shape, I don't necessarily want to go back in the complete opposite direction, because that's going to pose just the same problems. Whereas if I go through and kind of fill in with a very soft circular shading, it's going to fill in those gaps without changing the look of the shape. So then if I want to put just a little more purple on there, I can to kind of even it out. And at this point, I could go ahead and consider it done. Once I finish this layer, I could add some blue to both sides. I could add the opposite color to both sides. I could add some actual white colored pencil in the middle. So once again, the combinations and how you use the colors is completely up to you. The main thing that I am looking for is that you are practicing your shading technique and really focusing on getting as smooth transitions in there as possible. So that's just one example of what it could look like to do one shape with two colors, like some of you were asking about. And once again, color is up to you. The main thing I'm looking for are smooth transitions in values. So during the next video, I'm not going to talk. I'm just going to fill in some of the shapes in some different ways so that you can see some more of the options that you have. But I also want you guys to be creative and think about, what can you come up with on your own? What sort of ideas and combinations and value transitions can you think of to use and implement in this project?